Welcome back. So we got our monthly Grail tier list update, or I guess tier list video, or whatever you want to call it. But anyway, we got a bunch of new skills, we got a couple new heroes, and we got a refund at the beginning of the month. As such, I do want to quickly go over what I think changed over the course of that period of time between the last video and this one, and whether or not it's worth looking into some units for future investments. So yeah, that's what we're going to do today. And before we do get into the video, I do want to give a few prerequisites before I show you all the lists. So here's the general list of what I use to determine the ranking, and what's essentially the final ranking and recommendation for investing into certain units over others. For context, I use 3 tier lists in the form of an Aether Raids tier list, a Summoner Duels tier list, and an Arena tier list. Every Grail unit should hopefully be accounted for, although in the past I've missed a couple, so you'll have to let me know if I did it again. I'm hoping I didn't. But basically, it's going to be following a quote-unquote golf rule set where the characters that have the lowest tally, aka like if they're tier 1 or they're the highest tier, they get 1 point. The ones that have the least amount are going to be the ones that are going to be ranked the best at the end of the video. Likewise, I think it's also worth mentioning that if you aren't looking for some things out of a unit over another, that's totally fair, and you can take each individual list on their own accord. And yeah, those are pretty much the must-knows for all these tier lists, so we may as well get right into it. I would say compared to last month, there weren't many newer additions to either the skill pool or the Grail shop, although we usually just get 2 a month anyway. I think it was relatively light overall, and if we did get new tier 4 skills or just new additions in general, they were more so just variants of what was already pre-existing. So something like speed res catch is something that, well, technically new, isn't something that brings anything new to the table, if that makes any sense. That being said, there are still plenty of things that can be talked about, including the new units, the new refine, and just some general promotions and demotions that I made, aka just the general changes, mainly due to either the arcane or some additional skills that did actually play a role in some promotions and demotions. For the new units in particular, including Astrum, who got his refine, I put Spring Michaelis in decent, Vigard in solid, and Astrum I didn't really change around, but I do think his overall playstyle is definitely a lot better than it was, well, prior to the refine, because prior to the refine it was just basically a nothing weapon. It granted visible stats at the start of a turn, but that was something that was very replicable, especially before his refine. And while that's still the case to this day, I think overall the weapon is definitely an upgrade, especially if you are looking to use Astrum. However, I don't know how much of an upgrade it technically is, because at the end of the day, it is just stats. And while there's nothing wrong with stats overall, I find that at some point you are going to want some combat effects that will give you some combative advantages over others. However, I think it's worth mentioning that if you are looking for an infantry stat ball, he could do it relatively well, because he does just get 14 to everything from his weapon, which is pretty nice. You also have Spring Michaelis and Vigard, both of who are fairly generic because they lack a PRF, and because of that I pretty much slotted them in the same placement that a lot of other similar units would be in. Spring Michaelis can work relatively well in an Aether Raid setting, especially if you are trying to use him as a Gale Force unit. I don't necessarily think his best role is going to be enemy phase, because flyers don't really have a lot of abilities to act in the enemy phase. However, thanks to the Arcane Lance that was added a couple months ago, I think he can act as a relatively okay follow-up Gale Force unit, or if you wanted to make him your primary Gale Force unit, you could always give him Double Fury, and that should be fine. I wouldn't say he's crazy amazing, but I wouldn't say he's downright unusable, and that really just boils down to the fact that he could use Gale Force with the Arc, which is a really good combination. Meanwhile, with Vigard, he's an armor, and as with every armor, they cheat because saves are oh so great. And that isn't to say that I would put Vigard on the same level as maybe someone like Gilliam, because, well, Gilliam has a really good PRF while Vigard is going to be stuck with the arcane. But I think through a Grail and free-to-play player perspective, I don't think Vigard's going to be struggling a lot, especially if you were to make him a near save, or even far save for that matter. I think Vigard's tanking ability as a near save is really good because of stuff like Seliph, who is pretty much everywhere. On top of the fact that the arcane does grant a guaranteed follow-up, meaning that he doesn't necessarily have to give up his B for any other fighter, and while you could still use another fighter, if the foe has no follow-up anyway, you're not going to be doubling regardless, because they don't stack like that. Unless you are hit by an impact, in which case you can always just double through it with another guaranteed follow-up, but chances are that's not really going to be the case. And because of that, you could always give him something like Seal Attack 4, and he could actually become a really tanky unit. And again, I really think that just boils down to the fact that the Arcane has Slaying and Breath built into it, so you don't necessarily have to give up some slots for a fighter skill, or breath, or whatever the case may be. and he's really just going to be performing the same as maybe like Cervantes or a lot of your other generic armors. But for that reason, I still think it's worth putting him in solid. However, outside of the newer units, I did want to briefly touch on some promotions and some demotions, because I do think it's worth highlighting now that we have newer skills in the game that can make a lot more units replicable in certain niches. For example, Fallen Dorothea has her whole 2-space teleport gimmick with a lull effect and a bunch of stats, which is pretty good. However, I do think because of Guidance 4, at least on the Aether Raids side, it's not going to be as much of a desirable niche. Or I guess a better way of phrasing it would be that a lot of other units can pretty much do the same thing if you're looking to get the jump on somebody. And while you would need to run Guidance 4 somewhere on the team, I don't necessarily think it's going to be that big of a cost factor, especially if you were to run a Mythic who's already a flyer and has an available C slot for it to go on. So maybe someone like Mirabilis, you could put that on there and that should be perfectly fine to go. Otherwise, I did want to briefly touch on Jomp, who does have a relatively good PRF for what it's worth. It is a slaying bow that has a guaranteed follow-up and innate desperation if the speed checks are made, which depending on where you use them can be really easy or really difficult. But regardless, the reason I have him demoting is less because of his PRF and more so because of the Arcane, which also has slaying and a guaranteed follow-up and makes up for the attack deficit. And while you could definitely argue that he's going to have a lot more speed than a lot of the other generics, I think the trade-off of the stats and desperation versus damage reduction that you can get from the weapon, which also stacks with stuff like Remote and Guard 4, is definitely worth mentioning. And because of that, I do think Jomp, while still relatively good on his own, I think is worth pushing down just a bit. Mainly because if you are looking for a unit just to hit hard, then the Arcane is definitely going to make up for that deficit because you do get a fair amount of additional attack from it. And other than that, you have Masquerade Eldigan, who really just got blown the hell out because Milla's remix gives her a good amount of visible defense, meaning that Milla is pretty much impossible to dodge nowadays unless you have like an even higher defense unit, which I think the only one who really can is Spring Michaelis, but maybe there's something there you could do with it. Regardless, I find that Masquerade Eldigan's niche of being the Milla dodge counter is not really going to be holding up nowadays, mainly because a max invested Masquerade Eldigan can just get countered by a refined plus defense Milla, which isn't really going to be hard to do. And for those who just want to do it on an extreme budget, whether that's not giving 8 flowers and Fortress Defense Res or whatever, you could just give her Summoner support and then 3 flowers. And at that point, you've already beaten Eldigan. And because of that, I did push him down. And while I was initially going to push him down 2 tiers, I find that he could still do the same old Arcane Gale Force dance combination like Bridal Larum, although in my opinion just a bit less effective because she does at least have a fair amount of speed to work with in the instance where there's follow-up denial. Otherwise, I do want to talk about some promotions with the bow units thanks to the Arcane Bow and the Spring Dagger that we got from Spring Ash. I would say despite Whitecap and Wyvern Yumi existing, I think the Arcane is a relatively good contemporary to these other weapons. Whitecap definitely benefits from the really fast units, but with it being a 10 speed requirement on top of the just newer units just having 50 base speed with a boon nowadays because Intelligent Systems really is power creeping speed to all hell, I think there's an argument to be made for the Arcane, especially for the units that were already able to use Whitecap but are more so falling off nowadays because of the speed check. For a quick summarization, it's a guaranteed follow-up with Spectrum 5, Slaying, damage reduction, and a bunch of extra attack based on the foe special, which I think is pretty good for what it's worth, especially since you could put it on something like Dark Season and double no matter what, since the Arcane with a guaranteed follow-up does stack with Player Phase Brave as opposed to Whitecap, which doesn't stack with Brave anyway. And for the Player Phase side of it, I did promote Clarice and New Year Corrin, mainly because while they aren't exactly the craziest units, in fact, I wouldn't say they're really that amazing, I think the Arcane can provide a subtle niche that allows them to function on something like an Aether Raids defense setting as opposed to a lot of other units in that same category. Meanwhile, for enemy phase purposes, I ended up promoting Felix and Ignatz because, in my opinion, ranged armors really aren't going to be functioning all too well as far saves because there's so many effects that just pierce through damage reduction, taking away any semblance of damage reduction properties from any of these units, which is a big problem considering that the only way you're realistically going to be tanking those kinds of threats is with Hardy Fighter. However, you could always turn Felix and Ignatz into near seed, which may sound a bit dumb. However, I find that because you're not really going to be running into units that pierce through damage reduction as a 1-range threat, comparatively to a 2-range threat, that they might actually find more success doing that than running far save. And obviously, you're still going to have counters like Brave Self is just going to mark them because he's absurdly fast. You have Brave Crom with his armor effectiveness, Nana, Spring Carla, the list goes on. But I find that they're going to have more success doing that than gambling any sort of far save. And with the Arcane Bow and Savvy Fighter in tow, if they are able to get all their damage reduction off, they're going to be eating hits really, really well. And because of that, I ended up promoting them to the solid tier. Other than that, I promoted Gangrel and Jafar, who are going to be following a similar route to Clarice and Ignatz, respectively. Gangrel can use Springy Dagger with Remote, which isn't necessarily going to be as strong as the Arcane, because the Arcane has, well, Slaying and a lot of other stuff, to be fair. But with Spring Dagger having flat damage reduction on top of being able to access stuff like Remote and a good amount of infantry skills, I found that at the very least I could promote him at least to decent, because he could still follow a similar niche, albeit with less effectiveness. And for Jafar, he's going to be following the same route. It's going to be another similar situation where it follows a similar route of it being pretty good, but I don't think it's going to be as effective as the bows. And while I have Gangrel and Clarice and New Year Corrin in the same tier, I find that Jafar isn't quite capable of going into the solid tier, because I find that the slaying effect on top of all the other stuff that you get from the Arcane Bow is a lot more prominent. Even though you are banking on the damage reduction properties, I think the other effects help it stand out a lot more. And really, that's going to be it for the Aether Raids tier list. Like I said, there weren't that many new additions, which is why I do think this video is probably going to be on the shorter end comparatively to the other ones, but there's still stuff worth talking about nonetheless. Next, we have the Summoner Duels tier list, and this has a bit more changes comparatively to the Aether Raids tier list. However, I find that it was mainly more so for general adjustments to fit with a lot of the other stuff that I have on the tier list, more so than maybe a lot of the other newer additions. However, there are still plenty of things worth discussing with newer additions, including, well, the Grail units. Good transition, I know. I didn't really have much else on that front, so yeah. As previously mentioned in the Aether Raids tier list, they're pretty much going to be following a similar suit to a lot of the other generics that fulfill a similar niche. Because of that, they're pretty much going to be going in the same tiers as a lot of their other contemporaries. So Spring Michaelis is going to be following a similar suit to something like Heath or Cormag, mainly because they're generic flyers. They don't really do much outside of maybe the Arcane, which they could still take advantage of, but I don't think they're really going to be finding a lot of success comparatively to either armors, who again pretty much cheat, or units with PRFs, or just different movement types that have access to a lot more things. Meanwhile, with Vigard, he's going to be going into Superb because he follows a similar niche to Cervantes. They have the same Arcane, Hardy Fighter, yada yada yada, and that's really all it's going to boil down to. And I don't necessarily want the takeaway to be armor's good, everything else bad, because, well, it may be presented that way, but I think it is worth mentioning that despite how high they're scoring, it is only relative to their skill accessibility, which is really just going to boil down to saves in the Arcane and Hardy Fighter, which is still very important, especially for something like Summoner Duels. But I think if you are looking for something that has a lot more potential staying power, whether that's because they have a competitive PRF, they have access to a lot of good skills, you might want to consider maybe a lot of the other units in something like Solid, which are still really good on their own. But I think at least for Summoner Duels in particular, you may find that some of the ones in Superb are probably going to be a bit more effective. Although you could also debate that one way or the other. Feel free to let me know what your thoughts are on that. Otherwise, there's Astrum, who I did end up promoting from can work to the decent tier because of his refine. Although even if you didn't want to use it, you could still always use the Arcane with a bunch of attack and speed stacking, which is relatively fine on its own too. But I think if you were to compare it to something like Hulst, who is also a big stat ball with bonus doubler and guard and all that stuff, they're going to be relatively comparable. Although Astrum does lose out on guard, he ends up with more stats, which I don't think is necessarily the worst trade-off, but regardless, you may find that they're going to be fulfilling a similar amount of effectiveness, because at the end of the day, they're both basically stat balls. Otherwise, we have more general promotions and demotions. I first want to talk about Fallen Delthea, because in the Aether Raids tier list, I talked about how Guidance 4 kind of takes away a bit from her niche, and I still stand by that, mainly because you could set a fixed team to do certain things to catch the foe off guard. However, in Summoner Duels, you don't always have the opportunity to do XYZ comparatively to Aether Raids, which is why I do think while Guidance 4 is still a really good skill, Delthea having the flexibility to just use it whenever she wants is a really big boon. So much so, I probably should have had her in the Superb tier on the last video, and I'm mainly going to be rectifying it here. So that's really why I'm promoting her to Superb. On top of just having really good skill accessibility, she is just going to be a really decent threat if given the proper kit. And for what it's worth, she is having a Hall of Forms revival relatively soon, I think, or maybe it's like a month or two. Regardless, you'll be able to get a good amount of skills from her there if you are looking to invest into her. Otherwise, there's just a bunch of miscellaneous general changes that mainly just to line up with a lot of the other units, on top of what we did also discuss in the Aether Raids tier list, whether that was with a near save close reversal build with the Arcane or Bunny's Egg or whatever it's called, whatever Spring Ash has. That being said, I did at least want to bring mention to a potential far save build, which, while debatable in its effectiveness, I think is still worth highlighting because of the Arcane Bow and access to Special Fighter 4, meaning that if the foe is lacking any sort of ability to double or get 2 hits out before you can counterattack, you can always retaliate with a Deadeye, heal back whatever you took, and continue just having damage reduction from your bow, which is really, really good. That being said, I find that your most effective saves are going to be the ones at one range because they have access to stuff like Hardy Fighter. But I don't think it's necessarily the end-all be-all nowadays because they have access to Arcane Bow, which is a really flexible bow in general. Other than that, I did promote the Flying Lance Dancers, mainly Bridal Alarm and Dancer Eldigan, which I think are the only two, but regardless, they have access to stuff like Firestorm Dance 3 and Guidance 4, which is a very, very nice combination to have for your dancers in general. Firestorm Dance 3 granting a bunch of stats, the ability to cancel away after dancing, and Desperation is relatively good on its own, but because they are also flyers, they can access stuff like Guidance 4, which can be really, really good for your player phase nukes, especially if they are heavily speed stacked, because it can provide them stuff like no follow-up if they can meet the speed check, which is really, really, really good. And because of that, I find that they can provide a niche that their infantry counterparts can't, and vice versa. And I don't find that separating them into separate tiers is the right way to go. And again, otherwise, it's just more general changes with the arcanes, just to fit all the other ones, whether that's with a Vital Asher ×+4 set or a Godlike Reflexes set with the Arcane Downfall. That's really all these other adjustments are going to be for. And other than that, I did have a few other demotes, including Wallheart, Naysala, Finn, Julius, and Jomp. Wallheart, I don't necessarily think is a bad unit at all. I more so find that his ability to inflict flash isn't nearly as reliable in something like Summoner Duels because of the agency afforded to the player, since they could always just play around the flash. And while the range is still massive, it's really, really big, and you could always try and get in their face with something like Far Save, since we're getting a free from Modus anyway, so you could try something with Far Save and like Guidance or Order Support, so you could gradually get closer and closer to the foe, and then completely defense stack a Wallheart so that he could become a massive physical wall. I think there is potential there, but I feel that it's going to be a lot more map dependent than it's going to be given credit for, which is why I do think pushing him down a tier is probably the way to go here. Otherwise, there's Naysala, and Naysala is another one of those cases where I think he isn't necessarily a bad unit, but I don't think he fills a Summoner Duels niche whatsoever. In Aether Raids, I could always think of something like Gale Force because flashing and flow, which is really, really good, and a lot of attack and speed. But in something like Summoner Duels, I find that he doesn't really fulfill any sort of criteria for any sort of team. And while you could potentially find something to do with him, I don't think it's going to be any better than running something that you could just put on a catchy ball with like maybe an arcane or whatever the case may be. And I still think that all of these units are relatively good. I don't think they necessarily fulfill something worthwhile in Summoner Duels. I don't think this is necessarily a discredit to the units themselves, although you could still use a lot of Grail units for Summoner Duels purposes. I find that Summoner Duels is really, really cutthroat in what you can accomplish with certain units. And while you could definitely use any unit, I find that your success in using any unit in Summoner Duels is going to be much, much more different than using it in something like Aether Raids. But nevertheless, I find that Finn and Julius also fall into that category. Julius especially is worth mentioning because he does have a damage reduction tome, which scales off his res, so basically Dragon Wall, which is really good on its own. But I find that when it comes to just general tanking, I don't think he has enough to do it nowadays, since everything has some sort of way to pierce through damage reduction, He doesn't really have the highest defense stat as is, although you could still bolster it with his tome, which does grant a fair amount of attack debuffs. I find that if you're looking to act as an infantry tank, you do want some sort of ability to shrug off damage that pierces through damage reduction, so stuff like godlike reflexes is a great example. I think you'll find more success with a fast infantry sword or axe or lance than you would with Julius, because they have access to all sorts of other skills that Julius doesn't. And that's really all it boils down to. And as for jump, it's going to be another arcane adjustment. You can still do relatively good work on the Contrail Ball, but I also find that you could replicate a lot of the success with the arcane anyway. And that's about it for the Summoner Duels list. Other than that, it's the Arena tier list, which is going to be really short because it all boils down to BST. And out of all three lists to consider, I think this is the one least worth considering, mainly because it's all based on BST. Whether or not the unit is good is irrelevant, because if they can score, that's all that really matters. Although it's worth mentioning that if you were to use somebody that does score well and has a really good PRF, or something that doesn't make it feel like a slog to go through, it's definitely going to help, but BST is what really matters at the end of the day, unfortunately. And Vigard is no short on it. I had to make sure that Vigard was scoring the same as all the other units in Superb, and it turns out he doesn't. In fact, he scores more because he has 200 BST. He has 196 at base with a super boon in defense. So he's our first free-to-play 200 BST unit, which is insane to think about. Even though they somehow flubbed up his stat line because, yeah, they had 200 stats to allocate, let's just put a lot of them into speed for some reason and dump his res a bit. They gave him 200 BST, which is really good for scoring. And really, if you did want a score bot, he's probably your best bet. However, in my personal opinion, I think taking 5 BST off, or maybe like 10 for something like Lumera or Hans, as opposed to just running an armor, is probably going to be a lot less aggravating in general. But if the score is all you care about, then Vigard's probably going to be your best bet anyway. And with Spring Michaelis, he does score okay, but he scores about the same as a lot of the older units with B dual cavalry or any of the arena scoring skills. That's all it boils down to. He has a lot of BST and he doesn't have a PRF, so he kind of falls in the same line as all the other ones. And to be quite honest, I wouldn't really consider any of the other tiers if you are looking for a good score bot. And that's really going to be it for Arena because, well, it's BST, it's just BST comparisons. That's all it really boils down to. I did mention this at the beginning of the video, or relatively early into the video, that if you're looking for a unit for a specific game mode, just go by that, because at the end of the day, a lot of these rankings are going to be arbitrary in just the grand scheme of it all. All of these units are still going to be relatively weaker than a lot of the modern units that you could get nowadays, which I don't think is really surprising because these are free to play versus like Gen 7 like monstrosities like Lucia. Still, I think it's worth mentioning because you may see the final tally and think, well, that doesn't seem right, which maybe it isn't. But based off all the tier lists and their final scoring, I found that out of every unit that you can invest into, the 6 units that will probably give you the most value at this time are Vigard, Cervantes, Fallen Dorothea, Rutger, Lumera, and Zephyr. A lot of it is also fluctuated because of arena scoring, which is why I don't necessarily think it's the most worthwhile thing to take into consideration. However, because this is an overall general value Grail video, I figured it was something worth mentioning anyway, because you may end up wanting to use these units in other modes than maybe something like Aether Raids or Summoner Duels or Arena. If you're spending that many Grails and Feathers for them, chances are you probably want to use them a lot. And because of that, I ended up adding a fair amount of units that weren't just like score bots, because if it were just the like highest of the high, it was pretty much just going to be Vigard and Cervantes. And so I added other units that still scored really high, and in my opinion are still definitely worth looking into if you are looking for a good Grail project. And that's going to be it for the Grail video. Let me know what your thoughts are down below. If you like what you saw and you want to see more of it, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.